We're joined on INSEAD Knowledge by Peter Bowie, CEO of Deloitte China. Your company offers professional services to companies going into China, and also Chinese companies that are now looking to go global and essentially offering consulting services. What are you telling companies, first of all, companies that are going into China, about how they should approach the market?
Companies going into China are faced with a whole series of challenges as well as opportunities. Clearly there are major opportunities, as you can tell, given the growth in China for the last 25 years at an average of 9% a year, likely to continue for some time. But the flip side of that is there's a very, very competitive market. And what most companies don't see who are coming into China, they see a market that is competitive between, General Motors and Chery Automobile, between Hewlett-Packard and Lenovo, so large Chinese companies and large multinational companies coming into China. But in addition to that, there's a whole segment of the economy made up of 10 million Chinese companies who are growing, developing, challenging business models, really creating a domestic market. And it's a very competitive market. So we're telling companies, if you're coming into China, you need to really understand what your competitive advantage is going to be. And the second thing you need to do is have a strategy that allows you to localize as quickly as possible, because it is a very different market. A lot of companies coming to China see it as one large homogeneous market, but of course it's not. It's a very, very heterogeneous market. There are 60 different languages in China, and the consumption patterns in the West differ from the consumption patterns in the East, and so on. So it's very complex, it's very competitive, but having said that, there's some very significant opportunities.
According to McKinsey, one of the major issues has just been finding management talent. Yeah. That's still the case.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've got companies growing at 35, 40, 50% a year, and not small companies, big companies growing at that pace. In any market, anywhere, they're going to have a difficult time finding enough people to do what needs to be done. The challenge really is to try to differentiate yourself in the war for talent, as they say, and to try to attract and retain those people. And there are some ways to do that if you do it effectively. Clearly localization is one of them, but a real focus on learning and development and growth is another. Offering people international opportunities to go abroad and learn and develop is a third one. And there are a series of things to do that allow you to focus on retention. But it's tough. It really is tough.
Presumably this is an issue also for the Chinese companies, not just the multinationals.
Yeah. The state-owned companies seem to have a lower turnover rate. They offer a series of benefits and probably the perspective of long-term employment more so than others, except that the state-owned companies have been in tremendous restructuring for the last 10 years or so. And it hasn't been unusual over the last 5 or 6 years for the state-owned companies to restructure and have 10 million people laid off, in fact, and they have to find new jobs. But those who stay at state-owned enterprises seem to want to stay there for some time. So it's more competitive with private companies and MNCs, perhaps more so than state-owned enterprises.
And presumably the MNCs, the multinationals, are having difficulty in finding people who can speak English. That has been highlighted before.
Yeah, that's the challenge. And I think the challenge is not for the MNCs to find people who speak English, but for the MNCs to learn to speak Chinese and to use Chinese better. You're not going to build a company in China with 30 or 40,000 people who are all fluent English speakers. And even when you talk to people who can converse at a very simple level in English, it doesn't mean they're bilingual. It doesn't mean they can really appreciate the subtleties, just as you can if you're English, understand the Chinese. So the challenge really is for MNCs to adapt to the environment and the culture and the language, and those that do it best will be the ones that are most successful.
Your own firm has grown pretty significantly over the past couple of years. I think you've added something like 2,500 employees to a base of 5,000. So effectively, 50% increase.
Perhaps a little greater than that. We started with 2,000 people in 2003. We now have 8,000 people. And the challenge is not getting new students into our, because we hire students out of university. And this year we'll hire probably 1,800 people out of university. We're going to get 35,000 applications. So we get very, very good students. The challenge is the middle part of the structure. to help those kids grow and develop and become the best professionals they can be. And we try to do that by recruiting locally, but also by scouring the world for people who want to come back to China, and there are lots of those, and people who want to come to China. Because a lot of people now see the opportunities being in China as opposed to 10 years ago or 20 years ago, they were heading west. They're now starting to come east again.
From the McKinsey survey and from interviews we've done in the past with our own faculty, China's advantage is basically being able to offer low-cost products. And it hasn't gone up the value chain yet. Sooner or later it's going to have to move up the value chain. How can companies really compete though when it comes down to pricing?
First of all, I think that's become a bit of an outdated statement. China absolutely has built a substantial part of its economic growth on being the manufacturing heart of the world, low cost, high volume manufacturing. Underneath that, there's been evolving for some time now a very vibrant technology area. So for example, one of the leading companies in the world is a solar energy company called Suntech. They're doing lots of things, and there's a whole series of solar companies, alternative energy companies in China. They're doing some great things around clinical studies and healthcare. Companies like Huawei has become a significant competitor to companies like Cisco globally, ZTE and others. So there is percolating a very significant increase in the technology-based, innovation-based organizations in China. And that group of companies I talked about earlier, that's Chinese and very domestic, there's a lot of technology and software companies in there that are also growing very dramatically. And you get, organizations like China Mobile that has 400 million customers for its cellular phone services. That's creating a lot of innovation in telecom. And there's a lot of software companies that are selling online games and so on and so forth. And it's just the start of something that's going to be very big. You got a tremendous breadth and depth of talent. And with the right resources, which they're now starting to have, clearly they're going to be major competitors in a lot of areas of technology. So they're moving up the scale pretty quickly.
And Chinese companies are being encouraged to go global. Do you think they're going to face difficulties in achieving that?
Absolutely. Huge difficulty. I mean, the first thing they're being encouraged to go global for is resources, which is understandable. Oil and iron ore and so on, and we know the stories around that. But what they're facing is two issues. One is simply a lack of experience in the companies dealing abroad. This is a country that only talked about opening up in 1979, closed down again in 1989 for a few more years, and it's only recently opened up again. And there's an entire generation or two of leaders who have never had or had very limited experience globally. And so, but they're quick and they'll learn quickly to do that. A second thing is just the reputation of the country and the reputation of the companies. They need to think through very carefully, because people are, at least my experience is, people outside China are very wary of China because they're seeing tremendous growth. They're seeing an increase in economic and political influence, and they don't understand it. So while there's a tremendous increase in the awareness of China, there's not a commensurate increase in understanding of China. And so the challenge for the Chinese, broadly speaking, the government and the companies, is to move carefully, move deliberately, and try to improve both their image and their reputation globally, because it's extremely important. And if Chinese companies are trying to buy companies abroad, they have very little experience in international mergers and acquisitions. And it's very difficult to do those successfully anywhere. There's one study that came out recently examining over 3,000 companies that did M&A for a 10-year period, and found that 60% of them did not deliver on their expectations. Well, if you take that and you apply it to people who don't have the experience, that 60% is going to be somewhat higher. So they have lots of challenges. There are some good examples. I think Lenovo is a good example, and perhaps Huawei, although they've done it mostly domestically. But there are some examples emerging. But again, it's going to take time, simply because they haven't been at it very long.
And the Lenovo example that you gave, I mean, the success behind that is seen to be the American expertise, essentially.
Sure, but you have to look at the owners of the business, Lenovo, sat back and said, what do we need out of this? Well, we need to leverage on the expertise that the IBMers have. And they were smart enough to do that, and they were smart enough to figure out how to fit the cultures together. And they did some innovative things. You know, they appointed somebody to be in charge of developing international integration and international culture, which was a message to everybody that we're trying to blend these things and bring them together. I think it's a sign of very good leadership when you can blend two disparate cultures, because probably the Lenovo culture is different than the IBM culture, and certainly the Chinese culture is different from the US culture. So if you can blend all those together successfully, it's a very good achievement.
The McKinsey surveys pointed out something that's quite interesting, was that Western companies see there's intense competition coming from China, yet they haven't really done much in terms of altering their own strategies. And it almost seems to be a feeling of complacency almost.
At great risk, at great risk. You know, if you look at what's happening in China in the development of various industrial sectors, telecom, they're going abroad. Oil and gas, they've gone abroad. Retail, they're starting to go abroad, at least in Asia. And they will develop different approaches, probably somewhat different business models. But I think it's going to be hard for any business anywhere, almost, to escape some impact as a result of more efficient operations, lower cost, massive efficiencies. Added to that innovation that's coming, I think any business outside China that doesn't have some sense of what's going on in China and some sense of awareness of what's going on will be at risk.